Well, we've got a lot going on, if you can't tell by how distracted I am in the moment. There's a lot happening this month, a lot of really neat stuff going on. And I want to direct you to your programs, especially the white card, which serves as our means of communication with anything you have going on that you want us to know about. We can pray for you guys. I'm going to have Melody come on up, and she's going to talk a little bit about these amazing Christmas decorations. I'll stop talking too soon. And it's going to sound really good and exciting.
Good morning. Do you like them? Yeah, it's gorgeous, isn't it? To everybody who contributed, thank you. I do want to point out a couple of people. Raina, this was Raina Scott's idea. She came to us with an image, and you get to see how that came about. And I want to definitely thank Stephanie Peters, who really was kind of the driving force through this entire experience. She pulled volunteers together. She kept us on task. So I really want to thank Stephanie and Josh and Christy and Ralph and Gladys and the Tuesday Night Nampa small group that came out. Just tons of people. Yesterday we had about 20 people here finishing lights and putting up ornaments. It was fantastic. So thank you to all of you. One small note, I know Chip's going to talk about it, but for caroling tonight, we will do something. So feel free to come by at 5. We may not get out too much depending on the weather, but we will do something. So if you are planning on coming, please do.
All right. Yeah, like Melody said, 5 o'clock tonight if you want to do some Christmas caroling. It's either, if it's too miserable and wet, we might have an alternative activity. If it's snowing, that's a bonus, because that's how it's supposed to be. But in any case, you can show up here for that. Also, as far as Christmas goes, we have a children's program that'll be happening on December 18th. You definitely want to see that. We also have our Christmas Eve and Christmas services. Christmas Eve, we'll be meeting here at 4 o'clock. Christmas morning, we'll have one service at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it'll be the same service. So depending on your family's movement and tradition, you can pick one of those. Just remember that there's only one service on Sunday morning. So this morning, we're moving forward. We've been talking about relational exercises, and today we cross over into our holiday season, and we get to begin celebrating Advent. And I'm really excited about this whole conversation about the birth of Jesus and celebrating that. And, if you grow up in church, then you can, or if you grew up in America as a Christian or even ever watching television, you've seen at least the Charlie Brown Christmas special, where, isn't it Linus that reads the Jesus story in that most adorable voice that I can never come close to this morning? But he reads out of Luke chapter 2, the birth of Jesus. And we've got this scene in our heads, the nativity scene out of Luke chapter 2. And if you think about it, the nativity scene is almost as iconic as the cross in terms of Christianity. Almost as recognizable, although we don't wear nativity scenes around our necks, I guess, very often. But if you see this silhouette, you know immediately what that is. And we're going to spend the next few weeks kind of unpacking the Christmas story, and our goal is to kind of do Christmas in context. And we're going to be looking at a lot of context. But one thing that's really fascinating to me is popular culture. I'm always interested to see how is art and how is popular art especially kind of reflecting on the things that we know and that we experience in life. And so all week, Melody and I have been kind of laughing over these alternative nativity sets. And so I brought a few for you to see so that you can kind of get a sense of different people's takes on nativity. One of my favorites is the Star Wars nativity, which you've got here. Someone went through a lot of energy to really put together some Endor foliage around the R2-D2 baby Jesus. It's okay to appreciate this. It's not sacrilege. You guys are being really quiet. Like, can we laugh at that? Is that bad? Next one, I think, is the Cupcake Christmas nativity scene. There we go. This one I love because it's so adorable. But what happens when it's time to eat it? I mean, who gets to eat the baby Jesus? It just seems like it's problematic when all is said and done. Next one we have is also breakfast food. I think not as beautiful, visually pleasing, but I think I might enjoy this a little bit more, the sausage and bacon nativity. Up there on the list has to be Messiah Time, where, you've got somebody needed a manger and they were out of mangers. I just can't even, I wish I could see that in person somewhere and talk to them. Someone actually did decide who gets to eat baby Jesus in the T-Rex version of the nativity scene. We've got the dinosaur coming in here. My favorite is the Monster Mash. You know, if you're going to take popular culture and kind of like lay it over things like the nativity scene, you've got to have, you know, the Frankensteins as the doting parents. And the cow just looks kind of confused back there. In any case, we won't distract you too much more with that. We've got the nativity scene. We've got this concept that we're so familiar with. We can take it off anytime, Melody. Thank you. You guys are like, Dracula, is he a shepherd or a wise man? I'm not sure. We've got this scene in our heads. We've got this sense of nativity, and we've got a narrative that we've got in our minds. And if we know better than to imagine it with a prehistoric animal or a 12-pack for a manger, we still, even so, have developed over the centuries sort of an ongoing narrative of what was going on that night. And we say that night when Jesus was born. And what I'd like to do over the next few weeks, and especially this morning, is sort of look through this familiar passage in Luke chapter 2 and see if we can't pull out some context to lay as a backdrop to our story and see what that does to our understanding of how we imagine the story of Jesus and Jesus being born. As it is, we have an understanding of the nativity of Jesus being born that actually a guy named Kenneth Bailey, who's a scholar from the Middle East who teaches Bible and studies Bible, has traced back largely the story that we understand in the nativity to a novel, a 4th century novel from a Christian who was trying to write out the story. It was called the Proto-Evangelion of James. Not that James wrote it, but it was put in his name. And essentially, it kind of paints the backdrop to how we understand the nativity. When we think of nativity, we often think of sort of a dark intensity, don't we? We imagine this couple terrified, and we like to point out that they were probably teenagers, which we would be terrified. You know, how many terrified teenagers are, if a teenager ends up being pregnant, that's horrifying, and that's the whole ball of wax, and it's a whole big thing that we navigate and have to figure through, but there's some anxiety involved in that. And we imagine this young couple being pregnant, being forced to go to Bethlehem, and we picture them running through the desert at night on a donkey, right? There's always a donkey. And through the desert, probably at night so they don't fry during the day. It's probably, we imagine it really hot. And then they barely get to town with this young lady about to have this baby, and they're totally isolated because they've been rejected from every possible place that they can stay, and they end up in a stable. We don't say barn anymore because we've kind of figured that out. Okay, well, there probably weren't barns. But they end up with the animals where she lays the baby in a manger. Exactly. The whole thing, the way we imagine it, carries with it tones of rejection, isolation, humiliation, darkness, fear, anxiety, doesn't it? And then we sing joy to the world. And we talk about this celebration and the good news. When the angels that we'll talk about later come and are talking to shepherds, they say, we need you to tell everybody about this amazing thing, this good news. And so we have in this kind of juxtaposition of a story, of a narrative that's dark and scary, and yet somehow there's this amazing celebration of joy attached to it. And I think that becomes, if you're anything like me, that becomes a little bit problematic sometimes. You're thinking, so how does that fit together? Is it just the fact that it's the Messiah, that's supposed to be joyful? Because the story sounds a little bit dark. So what I'd like to do today is look at context and see if we can't put ourselves 2,000 years ago in the Middle East to try and imagine this story the way Luke lays it out, look at our larger biblical context and the rest of the story of Jesus as Luke lays it out, and see if we can get our minds around what was going on there. So what I'm going to ask of you is that you sort of lay aside your narrative of the nativity that we've got, and let me tell you, this is a huge exercise for me because it's so ingrained. But lay that aside for a moment and see if you can't visualize what we do as we walk through this contextually. Why does context matter? If you order pizza and someone knocks on the door, that's a wonderful thing in context. If you're counting out the money from your bank robbery and someone knocks on the door, totally different experience, right? A lot of nervous bank robbers laughing there. Here, let's try something. Let's do some word association. Are you ready to do some word association? Sure. Okay. Someone besides Mark, this is where you're going to need to feedback. I'm going to say a word, and I want you to yell back to me what comes to mind immediately when you read this word. Is it fair enough? Okay. All right. Let's try one. Farm. Animals, pigs, cows, horses, food, work. Yeah, I kept thinking I'd hear some kids say chores. Nobody said funny either. Okay. Next, Boise, Idaho, busy, beautiful. If you were here last service, you're like, oh, he finally said Boise instead of Boise. Maybe he's one of us now. What else do you hear, boys? Trees? What's that? Broncos. Sports, we got the college. How about the word pregnant? Oh, no. Get a lot of that. I got an oops last service. Pain. Baby. Teething. Wait, did someone say teething? Okay, we'll talk about the sequence later. Diapers, grandma. Okay, see, context really matters there. How about this? Garage. Car. Storage. Sale. I always think garage, I had to take my car to the garage, but I think that's like an old thing. I think that dates me a little bit. Sale, garage sale. One more. Visiting family. Okay, we got some moans and groans. What other words come to mind? Food. Thanksgiving, fun. Stress. Okay, so we got a broad spectrum there. All right, enough with the word association. I want to look at Luke chapter 2 in the first 7 verses, and I want us to say to ourselves, okay, what is going on here? Because as we've just demonstrated here right now, context is everything. If I say the word farm, I know what I mean, but you might have a completely different perspective on that. So let's look at this, let's unpack a little bit of the context, and let's try to give ourselves a picture in our imaginations of what Luke is trying to accomplish when he sits down and writes to Theophilus about this story of Jesus being born, his incredible life, sacrifice, and resurrection. Fair enough? Yes, Chip. Move forward. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. At that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All returned to their own ancestral towns to register for this census. And because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee. He took with him Mary, his fiancée, who was now obviously pregnant. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her first child, a son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no lodging available for them. Now, what I'd like to do is kind of walk through this story. Let me throw in a couple of items of context as we begin to kind of clean slate this story in our minds. First of all, let's talk a little bit about census. It was at this time the Roman Emperor Augustus decided that there would be a census. And basically, our census is there for what? Taxation. So this is something that occurred often. This is the first time that Quirinius, well, he's the governor of Syria, is doing it. But this is a census. This is something that happens periodically under Roman rule. They have to keep track of who's there from where so they can figure out how much taxation they can glean from the people in order to continue overtaking the world. Right? A couple of weeks ago, we had Rick talking about David did the same thing, but his count was more to see how much of a soldier force he had, how much power he had to go to war. A similar concept here, but they're talking more in terms of taxation because they were oppressing over these people. Does that make sense? We've got a census. It's there for taxation. We've got Mary and Joseph. Joseph, being a descendant of King David, we'll talk about that in a second, has to take Mary, and they've got to go to Bethlehem from Nazareth. So Nazareth to Bethlehem, 70 miles plus or minus, about a 4-day walk. We know they weren't traveling in cars or covered wagons or anything like that. A couple of things about a census and traveling from Nazareth to Bethlehem that I would put out here. A lot of this stuff, by the way, if you're looking for a resource, comes from a guy named Kenneth Bailey. Really amazing scholar. I think I mentioned his name earlier. And it's really cool to be able to get now some scholarship from the Middle East with guys who are doing these studies, who are looking at this stuff in background and are actually living there. You know, when Jennifer and I, we lived for a while in Salinas, California, which if you ever forced to read, if you ever got to read The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck, his Salinas is like his hometown. So to read Steinbeck living in Salinas is an amazing experience. Because you're like, look out the window at the stuff he's talking about. There are no grapes, no wrath. But in any case, so to be able to read from these guys who now have the scholarship of Bible study in the context of the Middle East, they can say so much to us. So let's say something about a couple thousand years ago, a couple with a pregnant fiance trying to travel 70 miles on foot from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Jesus once told a story later on. When he was older, he would tell a story about the Good Samaritan. What happened in the story of the Good Samaritan? There's a guy who's traveling alone, and what happened to him? He took a beating. He got waylaid. He was traveling by himself. He was attacked and robbed and left for dead on the side of the road. Now, Jesus is telling this story about a Samaritan who passes by and takes care of the man to paint a picture of this kind of grace in the face of all the religious people that would walk past someone stuck on the side of the road. The context of that story for Jesus and the people he's talking to would have been one of an assumption they would make of, oh yeah, nobody travels by themselves. If you travel by yourself, what's going to happen? You're going to get waylaid on the side of the road. Let me tell you a story about a guy that got waylaid on the side of the road, and a Samaritan came to help him. Does that make sense? So get into your head for a moment this concept that 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, if two people, especially with a pregnant fiance, had to travel 70 miles to get to Bethlehem, they did not travel by themselves. Okay, now we're starting to have to now we're really having to set aside our narrative, right? So these two people were not by themselves hurrying along the road to get to where they were going. They would have traveled in a group. We also can grab this because we see not too far away from this in the book of Luke, where he describes when they took Jesus to the temple when he was a little boy, one of the last stories before all of a sudden he's an adult. They take him to the temple, and they're on their way home, and what happens? They lose Jesus. It's like a couple of days, and Mary's like, wait, where's the kid? Where's the boy? And they go freak out, and they find him back at the temple. Well, how do you do that? How does Mary lose her son? Well, you're traveling with a huge group of people. All the kids are over there. Amix, have you ever lost a kid every once in a while? Sometimes you get it all everywhere. They're like, yeah, don't admit it. It's fine. They lost a kid. Everyone travels in a huge group to go to the temple, and they've all got their kids, and on the way back, Jesus gets lost, and that makes sense to people who are listening to this story because we travel in groups. Mary and Joseph, when it became time for them to go to Bethlehem, would have gathered with all the other people on their way to Bethlehem, and they would have traveled in the safety of numbers to get there. Now, don't start thinking too far ahead, but allow yourself to form that picture in your head because it's a little bit different than what I've always understood it to be. Here's a couple in a huge group of people traveling together in a herd almost. Another thing to talk about here is that Joseph was a royal. Joseph was actually a descendant of King David, and they were on their way to Bethlehem, who everyone around there knew and called by the name the city of David. Now, if you were to walk into Nampa and say, hi, my last name is Karcher, and be like, oh, or hi, I'm Simplot. Can I borrow a few bucks? I'll pay you back next Tuesday. That's probably a safe bet. That's probably a safe loan. We know if you say Snodgrass, check references. Take a deposit. To walk in and have a name like that is to be known. So for Joseph to go back to Bethlehem to report for a census, besides the fact that he may have already done that at some point as a younger man with his parents, he would have walked into Bethlehem as a descendant of David himself, not just a guy who's originally from Bethlehem, but an actual descendant of the guy who the town is named after. He went back as a Nampa. He was from the family of Nampa. And so for him to walk in there, this idea that they would have come into town and would have faced this wall of rejection of people saying, you know what, not with us. No, I don't know. Who are you again? Put in your mind, in your narrative as you're constructing it here, this couple traveling in a group going to the town that is named after Joseph's family. I love, too, when we go a little bit further in this story, and Luke says he was traveling with his fiancée, Mary, who was obviously pregnant. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't ever trust a guy. I don't trust a guy to say, that woman is obviously pregnant. Because it's so quiet right now, I'm guessing that there are some of you men who have made this mistake before of saying, how far along are you? And never speaking to that person again. None of that is to say Mary wasn't pregnant, but we don't know what that means, except that you could tell she was pregnant, I guess. So Luke says she was obviously pregnant, or she was, if you're going to try to directly translate, big with child, And so Mary and Joseph are traveling to Bethlehem, and she's big with child. Something that we have to point out here, too, if we're going to try to construct a contextual narrative here, is how do we deal with pregnant ladies when we see them? Gently, with great care. We accommodate them. I have spent the third grade in Costa Rica, and we lived in the city. We didn't have a car. We had to walk and ride buses everywhere. And if you got on a bus and you didn't give up your seat to a pregnant lady, you could get thrown off the bus. In fact, my mom with my sister, who was 2 at the time, someone would always get up. And you're talking about a packed thing where everyone's standing up and hanging off the bars. And if you didn't get up, that was considered horribly rude. Take that concept to the Middle East, where there's an entire standard of culture built around hospitality, and you throw a pregnant woman into the mix, and you have to know that this woman, who was obviously pregnant, was going to be taken care of. Nobody is going to allow this obviously pregnant woman to go out in the woods to have a baby. You following me? Okay, we're slowly building this picture in our minds, this narrative. While they were there, she has the baby, her firstborn, a son, which again, we have to get into our heads. We have this picture going back to the Proto-Evangelion where they're on the donkey and she says, "Get me off of this ass before I burst," or something along those lines in Greek. And Joseph ditches her in a cave and goes to find a midwife and all this stuff, the way the story goes, the way he wrote it originally. And we have to put ourselves in this mindset again, and we have to read, what does Luke say here? He says, while they were there, they were in Bethlehem. This isn't the middle of the night. They didn't just barely make it into town. While they were there, she has the baby, and she wraps him in strips of cloth. Or some of you have written in your translation, swaddling clothes. Now, we swaddle our kids here, too. I was saying in first service how, I remember it was a couple of days before I was willing to really unwrap my son when we first had our son, and I would tear him open, throw a diaper on him, and then wrap him up again. Because I got in my head whatever I heard and understood from all my studying about how to be a father, all I knew was don't let him get cold, And so it was a few days before I finally just said, I need to look at this kid, and I let him unfurl. I don't think he realized he had legs until I finally swaddled him. But we swaddle kids. Your average Syrian refugee who's coming into Boise even this week, probably there's a percentage of them that were wrapped in strips of cloth, in swaddling clothes when they were born. To this day, this is still an average, normal way of treating a baby who's born, which we have to be careful of. Because again, when we imagine this dark and isolated narrative, then I just imagine that Joseph had to tear up his favorite Aerosmith t-shirt so they could wrap the kid in something because they were out in the middle of nowhere with nothing. But while they were in Bethlehem, Mary has this baby and she wraps him in swaddling clothes. Everyone who hears this, everyone who pictures this in the Middle East would imagine a mother having a baby and holding him. And he's swaddled. Now is where it gets really interesting, because she lays them in a manger. Why? Because there's no lodging for them. Or some of you say have a translation that says there's no room for them in the inn. Let's talk a little bit, and I don't want to get too harsh into language, but I will get artistic, if that's okay with you. Let me show you kind of the anatomy of a house. At one point, Jesus tells a story, and he says, you light a lamp, and it gives light to the whole house. You remember when he says that? And he talks about don't put your light under a bushel, but you will put a light, and it'll light up the whole house. Not my house, probably not your house either. But if your house has a floor plan like this, which was highly likely a couple thousand years ago when Jesus was born, you've got a home, and it basically has a floor plan like this. Coming in the front door, you've got sort of a little lower area, and then up above, a little bit raised, is the rest of the house. If you're looking at it from the side, it'd probably look something like this. So what you end up with in a house that was typical of that day in Bethlehem, what you would see is the entryway with this lowered portion where at night you would bring all of your livestock into the living room. Now, automatically that's problematic for us because we think farm, we think animals, we're thinking dairy farm. How are you going to put all those hundreds of cows into this? And what would that smell like? What would that look like? But again, we got to put ourselves in context. 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem, livestock meant your donkey, your cow, not your herd. Now, sheep were something that there were a lot of sheep and shepherds. There were shepherds in this story that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, and those were communally put together inside of a pen with one shepherd that would be delegated to lay across the opening, and Jesus talks a lot and uses a lot of parables about sheep and shepherds. But the average household would bring their animals in here at night. Now, it accomplished a couple of things. One is so that they would warm the house, and the other is that your animals wouldn't be stolen in the living room. Now, separating the living room from the rest of the area on the floor, you would typically have your mangers. So now you've got your animals in the living room at night, and you've got these mangers where the animals can feed and eat while they're in the house at night. Again, keeping this stuff out of the elements and keeping it warm. And this is your floor plan. Now, a lot of houses often would have a katayuma. Say that with me. Katayuma. I'm sure that's the pronunciation. It was often put on top of the house in the back, or sometimes it would be an add-on into the back. And essentially, a katayuma is a guest chamber. Last service, someone said they heard me say gas chamber. Totally different. This is a guest chamber, katayuma. It's an upper room or a back room where you would put guests. Now, when Jesus is celebrating Passover with his disciples, he says, I want you to go into Jerusalem, and there you'll find a certain man, which leads to believe he had a friend. You'll find a certain man, tell him that the Messiah is coming and he wants to celebrate Passover, and he will take you and set you up in his katayuma, his upper room. So when we picture Jesus and the disciples at the Last Supper, they're in the guest chamber. They're in katayuma. Okay? Now, unfortunately, we've got a history where at some point that got translated as inn, maybe because of the guest part. The word for inn, that would be a place where you pay to stay, is a totally different word that I'm not going to try to pronounce. But if you go back to the story of the Good Samaritan, The Samaritan finds a man waylaid, left for dead on the side of the road. He picks him up and he takes him to a place and leaves the money to care for him and puts him in a place where you pay for lodging. A different word that Luke uses for that. So here we have every reason to believe contextually that when Luke says there was no room in the katayuma, it was so crowded at Bethlehem that nobody had a spare room for them. So Mary and Joseph had to stay in the same rest of the house with everybody else. Where the manger was, where the animals would be at night, so that when she had this baby, her firstborn, a son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes like you do with a baby, she would have laid him right there in the manger in the living room. Anybody's mind kind of getting blown here a little bit? Yeah. Jesus, the Messiah, born in a manger. If we go with a popular culture narrative that we've known, that I've certainly grown up with, we paint a picture of darkness, intensity, alienation, isolation, and rejection. And we imagine in our heads, if there's no room in the inn, that's people, like if you've ever been on a road trip with your kids and you're like, we got to stop and we got to stay somewhere tonight. And you're trying to call and you're in Scottsdale, Arizona, and you don't realize there's a football game that night, so there's nowhere to stay in the entire town. That's what we resonate with that because that's our experience. If we look back here and we ask, what was Luke trying to say? What was the picture that Luke is presenting when he lays out for us the story of the birth of Jesus? Let me read this one more time, and let's see if we can put this together in your mind as we're walking through it with the context that we've given it. At that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All returned to their own ancestral towns to register for the census. And because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee. He took with him Mary, his fiancée, who was now obviously pregnant. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her first child, a son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no lodging available for them. Incidentally, Bethlehem is in Judea. Do you know any characters in the story of the birth of Jesus that are in the hill country of Judea? Shepherds. Also, a woman named Elizabeth, who Mary went to visit immediately when she found out she was going to have God's baby. And Elizabeth was pregnant with John the Baptist. If there was nowhere, literally, for them to stay in Bethlehem, how angry would her relatives have been if they hadn't just gone to the hill country there? Imagine for a moment God incarnate, born as a child in all of normalcy and everyday way, traveling with his parents, Mary and Joseph. She's obviously pregnant, and they travel with everybody who's going to Bethlehem from Nazareth, and people are joining them along the road as they approach over that 70-mile road trip. And they show up in Bethlehem, and there's people everywhere. In context, and in the Middle East, someone would look at that and say, and obviously, since Joseph is a direct descendant of David, they found somebody to stay with. But it was so crowded, they didn't even get to stay in the upper room. Oh, that's crowded. And while they were there, the time came for Mary to have the baby, and she had the baby. Can you imagine? They're all in here, and there's people that are staying with them, and there's people up here and everywhere, and somebody says, "Oh my gosh, her water broke!" And they push all the men out the door, and the midwives and the women gather around Mary, and she gives birth to the Messiah, and they don't even know it. But Mary knows it, and Joseph is out there wringing his hands. The Messiah, the Savior of the world, born in community, traveled in community. When he was a little boy and they took him to the temple, they traveled with everybody. When he came into his own and at a wedding, he turned water to wine. He was at a wedding party for his first miracle. He chose 12 and then 75 and even more people, disciples who followed him everywhere, that he traveled constantly with over the span of his ministry. He was publicly executed and resurrected and showed himself to 5,000 people after being crucified and risen from the dead. He was around people so often that he would have to steal away to get some time alone, as he often did. How does it strike you to imagine this story in context when we'll talk about shepherds and angels saying, this is a day of great joy? When we say the coming of this king is good news. To imagine the context of this child being born in the middle of the milieu of life and of people. It makes so much more sense to me when we see and understand this to think about the things that God asks and expects of us as his people, even now today. When we find over and over in Scripture this God of relationship who refuses to separate our relationship with him with our relationship with other people and puts those things together in one package. It says, I long for you to live in relationship with me and with the others. I long for you to be my family, my children, and to live in community and in right relationship with each other. That sounds a lot more like the Messiah being born that we just talked about, doesn't it? Fascinating. I'm going to leave you with that a little bit and allow that to kind of mull over. And as a minor disclaimer, I'm just going to say my goal today is not to blow anybody out of the water and try to change your Christmas. Please don't go home and like dismantle your nativity scene. That is not what this is about. The context is so important. And as it turns out, and we wouldn't be talking about this otherwise maybe, as it turns out when we look at context, all of a sudden it just opens this story up so much broader to me in terms of what God is and what God is asking of us as his children. We're really cramped for time. I try to throw a bunch of stuff in there. So we're going to do communion this morning. And it's so fitting to enter Advent by taking communion together, to acknowledge that in the birth of Jesus, in this great, amazing celebration, that there's a whole element of the good news that has to do with him allowing his body to be broken and his blood to be shed for us. We're going to do this a little bit differently this morning. I'm going to pray for communion, and you can do it on your way out if you got to go grab your kids, or you can sit back down if you want, but I'm just going to lay it out here on the stage and have you come on up and grab the elements and take them. And then I'll close this up afterwards. If you're not up to the walking up here, if that's not physically possible for you, or you're just not really excited about that, we'll also we'll have someone with a tray, and you can just sort of signal, and we'll bring that out over to you. But I'm going to lay these out so that we can take these elements together. Let me pray. Father, our great goal in life is to know you. And we're so grateful for your word that gives us the narrative of who you are, of you establishing your people, and you bringing in an entirely new kingdom in Christ. We celebrate Advent with great anticipation of the birth of Jesus. And it is our greatest hope, Lord, to best understand what went on and what Luke was trying to illustrate as he told this story. And so this morning, even as we acknowledge that great story of your birth, we keep in the periphery our understanding that the birth was about a life lived, about so much to be taught, and about an ultimate sacrifice and resurrection. And so we take communion together, Lord, acknowledging your broken body, your shed blood, even as we celebrate your birth. Amen. And I don't know why that's so beautiful to me. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for the cross. Thank you for your unfailing, profound love. Thank you that to bring the Messiah into the world could be such an amazing communal act in the milieu of life. And even as we have to navigate the same thing, we pray that you would move in our souls, that you would heal our souls, that you would build up our hearts so that we can know you more and love each other better. We pray these things in your precious and holy name. Amen. Thank you guys. God bless.